The peace that followed the First World War was fragile, uneven, and filled with unresolved tensions. While people hoped the devastation of the Great War would be a war to end all wars, the treaties that followed only planted seeds for future conflict. Chief among them was the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which imposed harsh terms on Germany. The treaty blamed Germany solely for the war, demanded it pay massive reparations, and forced it to surrender vital. Many Italians believed their sacrifices had been ignored. Economic stagnation, political chaos, and public discontent paved the way for Benito Mussolini, who in 1922 marched on Rome and established a fascist regime. His rhetoric of national revival and the rebirth of a Roman Empire captured the imagination of many disillusioned Italians. In Japan, economic reliance on foreign imports and a growing population pushed leaders to seek new territories. After World War I, Japan expanded its presence in Asia, but still felt excluded from global decisions. By 1931, Japan had invaded Manchuria, and by 1937, it had launched a brutal war against China. In Europe and Asia, totalitarianism and militarism were on the rise, fueled by economic despair and nationalist grievances. Germany, humiliated and fractured, became the perfect ground for extremism. Adolf Hitler, a failed artist and veteran of World War I, capitalized on public discontent. His speeches stirred national pride, blamed scapegoats like Jews and communists, and promised a rebirth of German greatness. In 1933, he became chancellor and soon after, dictator. Civil liberties were suspended, political opponents eliminated, and the Nazi ideology, rooted in racial purity, authoritarianism, and territorial expansion took hold. The League of Nations, formed to preserve peace, proved powerless. When Japan invaded Manchuria, it protested but did nothing. When Italy attacked Ethiopia in 1935, the League condemned but failed to act. Its inability to enforce peace only encouraged further aggression. In 1936, Hitler defied the Treaty of Versailles and remilitarized the Rhineland. Britain and France, wary of war, did nothing. Emboldened, Hitler turned next to Austria. In 1938, German troops marched in and annexed it, with barely a shot fired. That same year, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. Britain and France, desperate to avoid war, agreed to Hitler's demands at the Munich conference. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously declared, "Peace for our time." But Hitler saw appeasement not as peace, but weakness. In March 1939, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. Later that year, Hitler and Stalin signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. Germany's Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, overwhelmed Poland. In a coordinated assault, tanks, aircraft, and fast-moving infantry smashed defenses before they could regroup. By late September, Poland was divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, as agreed in the secret clause of the pact. The West, although officially at war, remained largely inactive. This period became known as the Phony War. In April 1940, Germany launched surprise invasions of Denmark and Norway. Then in May, it attacked Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. Avoiding the heavily fortified Maginot Line, German forces pushed through the Ardennes forest, thought impossible by the Allies. In a matter of weeks, France collapsed. The British barely evacuated over 330,000 troops at Dunkirk. By June, German troops marched through Paris. With Western Europe under Nazi control, Hitler turned to Britain. He planned an invasion, but needed to destroy the Royal Air Force first. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940. German bombers pounded British airfields, radar stations, and cities. But the RAF, aided by early radar warning and brave pilots, repelled the attacks. The invasion of Britain was cancelled. It was Hitler's first defeat. Meanwhile, the war spread beyond Europe. Italy invaded Egypt from Libya. Germany sent forces under General Rommel to aid its ally. In the Balkans, Yugoslavia and Greece were attacked. German and Italian forces occupied most of southeastern Europe by mid-1941. Then, in June 1941, Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers stormed into the Soviet Union. The front stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Soviet defenses crumbled. Cities like Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev fell. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were killed or captured. Yet the Soviet Union did not fall. Stalin ordered scorched earth tactics, destroying anything useful to the invaders. As the Germans advanced toward Moscow, supply lines stretched thin. The brutal Russian winter set in. German troops, poorly equipped for the cold, froze. In December 1941, the Soviets launched a counteroffensive and pushed the Germans back. Operation Barbarossa had failed to deliver a quick victory. It became a long, grinding war of attrition. Just as Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, across the world, Japan prepared its own strike. Tensions with the United States had grown as Japan's conquests expanded. American sanctions, including an oil embargo, threatened Japan's war machine. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned, aircraft destroyed, over 2,400 Americans killed. The next day, the United States declared war. Stop. Germany and Italy, allied with Japan, declared war on the US in return. The conflict had become truly global. Japan advanced rapidly. It conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. Its empire stretched across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, but its expansion outpaced its resources and logistics. The tide turned at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. US forces, having broken Japanese codes, ambushed and sank 4 Japanese carriers. From there, the Americans began island hopping, capturing key islands while bypassing others. Back in Europe, the Nazis began implementing their final solution. Jews were stripped of rights, forced into ghettos, and deported east. Mobile killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen, massacred Jews by the tens of thousands. Then came the death camps, industrialized murder centers like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. Victims arrived in trains, were separated, and most were sent directly to gas chambers. Over 6 million Jews were murdered, along with millions of Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and others. Despite horror and repression, resistance grew. In occupied France, the resistance sabotaged rail lines and provided intelligence to the Allies. In Poland, the underground staged uprisings. In the ghettos, like Warsaw, Jews took up arms. In Yugoslavia and Greece, partisans waged guerrilla war. Even within Germany, some opposed the Nazi regime, though often at the cost of their lives. By 1943, the Axis powers began to lose ground. In North Africa, British and American forces defeated Rommel's Afrika Korps. Italy was invaded from the south. Mussolini was deposed, though Germans later rescued him and installed him as a puppet leader. The Italian campaign was long and bloody, but gradually pushed northward. The Eastern Front saw its turning point at Stalingrad. From August 1942 to February 1943, German and Soviet forces battled in the rubble of the city. It was one of the bloodiest confrontations in history. The Soviets encircled and trapped the German Sixth Army. Hitler refused to allow surrender, but in the end, over 90,000 German troops capitulated. Only a fraction would ever return home. Stalingrad was a crushing blow to German morale and momentum. After Stalingrad, the Soviet Red Army began a relentless push westward. Soviet counteroffensives in 1943 and 1944 reclaimed territory that had been lost in the early months of the war. Cities like Kharkov, Smolensk, and eventually Kiev were liberated. As the German lines collapsed, the scale of the Eastern Front's devastation became clearer. Entire towns were reduced to rubble, and the countryside was scarred by tanks, artillery, and mass graves. Millions had died, civilians and soldiers alike. Meanwhile, in the West, Allied forces began preparing for a massive invasion of occupied France. The date was set, June 6, 1944, D-Day. Over 150,000 troops, American, British, Canadian, stormed the beaches of Normandy under heavy German fire. The landings were bloody, the defenses brutal, but the beachheads held. Within days, more troops and equipment poured in. Hedgerows, small villages, and stone walls became deadly obstacles in the Norman countryside. But slowly, the Allies pushed inland. After Stalingrad, the Soviet Red Army began a relentless push westward. Soviet counteroffensives in 1943 and 1944 reclaimed territory that had been lost in the early months of the war. Cities like Kharkov, Smolensk, and eventually Kiev were liberated. As the German lines collapsed, the scale of the Eastern Front's devastation became clearer. Entire towns were reduced to rubble, and the countryside was scarred by tanks, artillery, and mass graves. Millions had died, civilians and soldiers alike. Meanwhile, in the West, Allied forces began preparing for a massive invasion of occupied France. The date was set, June 6, 1944, D-Day. Over 150,000 troops, American, British, Canadian, stormed the beaches of Normandy under heavy German fire. The landings were bloody, the defenses brutal, but the beachheads held. Within days, more troops and equipment poured in. Hedgerows, small villages, and stone walls became deadly obstacles in the Norman countryside. But slowly, the Allies pushed inland. Paris was liberated in August. By the end of 1944, most of France was free. In Belgium and the Netherlands, fighting raged. Hitler launched one last counteroffensive in the Ardennes, a surprise attack in December known as the Battle of the Bulge. German troops drove a wedge through American lines, but were eventually halted and pushed back. It was Germany's final gamble, and it failed. As the Allies moved east, the Soviets moved west. They liberated Warsaw, Budapest, and entered the Balkans. Resistance in Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia helped drive out Axis forces. The Red Army reached the Oder River, just 50 miles from Berlin. The once mighty German war machine was collapsing on all fronts. In the Pacific, the United States continued its island-hopping campaign. Battles grew fiercer as they neared Japan. At Tarawa, Marines faced withering fire from entrenched Japanese defenders. At Saipan, civilians were encouraged to commit suicide rather than surrender. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought in October 1944, was the largest naval battle in history. It marked the end of Japan's ability to conduct large-scale naval operations. The Japanese introduced a terrifying new tactic: kamikaze attacks. Pilots deliberately crashed their planes into Allied ships, inflicting heavy damage. It was a sign of growing desperation. American forces pressed on. In February 1945, they invaded Iwo Jima. The battle was savage, the terrain unforgiving. Nearly 7,000 Americans died. In April, they landed on Okinawa. Japanese resistance was fierce. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and tens of thousands of civilians died. The cost of each island grew higher, and the looming invasion of Japan promised to be bloodier still. At the same time, Allied bombers devastated Japanese cities. Incendiary raids on Tokyo killed over 100,000 people in a single night. Cities were flattened, infrastructure destroyed, but still, Japan refused to surrender. Germany, too, faced destruction. Allied bombers hit Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin with massive firebombing raids. Refugees flooded westward. German cities were in ruins, and the civilian population was on the brink of starvation. In April 1945, Soviet and American forces linked up on the Elbe River. The Reich was split in two. Inside Berlin, chaos reigned. Hitler, secluded in his underground bunker, issued impossible orders to imaginary armies. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet troops closing in, he took his own life. A week later, on May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Victory in Europe, VE Day, was declared. But the war was not yet over. In the Pacific, Japan remained defiant. The planned invasion, Operation Downfall, was expected to cost hundreds of thousands of Allied lives and perhaps millions of Japanese. The United States had a different option: a secret weapon developed under the Manhattan Project. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The city was obliterated. 3 days later, a second bomb hit Nagasaki. Faced with unimaginable destruction and the threat of more, Japan surrendered on August 15th. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, the surrender was formalized. World War II had finally ended. The cost was staggering. Over 70 million people had died: soldiers, civilians, victims of genocide and famine, of battle and bombing. Europe was a landscape of ruins. Cities like Warsaw, Berlin, and Stalingrad were shattered. In Asia, the Holocaust had revealed humanity's darkest depths. 6 million Jews were murdered in a systematic, state-sponsored genocide. Survivors emerged from camps barely alive. The world was forced to reckon with horrors beyond imagining. In 1945, the Allies liberated Auschwitz. The full truth of Nazi crimes began to emerge. Piles of human remains, gas chambers, crematoria, and mass graves told a story of mechanized murder. The Nuremberg trials sought justice. Nazi leaders were charged with crimes against humanity. Some were executed, others imprisoned. The trials established a precedent that even in war, there are laws, and that individuals, not just nations, can be held accountable. New international institutions were created to prevent such horrors from happening again. The United Nations was born in 1945, dedicated to peace, cooperation, and human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted 3 years later. In Europe, the foundations of future unity were laid. What would one day become the European Union? In Asia, The end of the war signaled the collapse of colonial empires. India's independence was just around the corner. Indonesia and Vietnam would follow. Africa, too, would begin to cast off colonial rule. The global order had shifted. The age of empires was ending. Two new superpowers emerged from the ashes: the United States and the Soviet Union. Their alliance would soon turn into rivalry. The Cold War began almost immediately with an arms race, proxy wars, and ideological struggle stretching from Berlin to Korea, Vietnam to Cuba. But for a brief moment in 1945, the world stood together in mourning and reflection. Technology had advanced rapidly during the war. Jet engines, radar, long-range bombers, nuclear weapons, all developed or accelerated by wartime needs. Medicine had progressed too. Penicillin, mass blood transfusions, prosthetics, all improved by the demands of saving lives in war zones. Social changes rippled outward. Women, who had entered factories in vast numbers, demanded recognition. In the US, the wartime effort laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement. In Britain and elsewhere, war gave rise to the modern welfare state. But above all, memory endured. Monuments were raised, cemeteries filled, survivors shared their stories or carried them silently. And across generations, people studied the war, not only to remember, but to understand, to ask why it happened and how it could be prevented. World War II was more than a clash of armies. It was a test of civilization. It showed how quickly the modern world could descend into chaos, but also how, through sacrifice, courage, and resilience, peace could be restored. As the war ended, the question of rebuilding loomed large. Nations lay in ruins, economies shattered, populations traumatized. The sheer scale of the destruction defied imagination. In Germany, cities were piles of stone and ash. Millions of people were displaced, living in temporary shelters, scavenging for food, searching for family. The once proud capital, Berlin, was now divided into 4 sectors, each controlled by a victorious Allied power: the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The post-war period demanded not only physical reconstruction, but also moral reckoning. The fall of Nazi Germany required a complete dismantling of its institutions. The process of denazification began. Nazi symbols were removed, party members barred from public office, textbooks rewritten. But it was a complex and uneven process. Many former Nazis quietly resumed their lives in the new West German state. The Soviet zone, meanwhile, evolved into East Germany, a communist state aligned with Moscow. Berlin became the symbolic heart of the Cold War. In 1948, the Soviets blockaded West Berlin, leading to the Berlin airlift, during which Allied planes supplied the city for nearly a year. In 1961, the Berlin Wall would rise, physically dividing a city and ideologically dividing a world. In the wider world, the war's aftermath accelerated decolonization. Britain, economically exhausted, could no longer hold onto its empire. India gained independence in 1947 after decades of struggle. Elsewhere, colonial rule faced resistance. The war had taught people that empires could fall and that self-determination was worth fighting for. In Asia, Japan was occupied by American forces under General Douglas MacArthur. A new constitution was drafted, renouncing war as a national right. The emperor, once considered divine, became a symbolic figurehead. Japan's economy and society were reshaped under American guidance. war criminals were tried in Tokyo, and the nation slowly began to rebuild. The United States emerged from the war as the most powerful nation on Earth. It had suffered few attacks on its soil, and its economy boomed during wartime production. The Marshall Plan, named after Secretary of State George Marshall, provided billions in aid to rebuild Western Europe. The goal was not only recovery, but stability, and to prevent the spread of communism. The Soviet Union, though victorious, bore immense scars. Over 20 million of its people had died. Entire cities had been destroyed. But it had also grown in power and territory. Eastern Europe became a Soviet sphere of influence. From Poland to Romania, pro-Soviet regimes were installed, often backed by force. The ideological line was drawn. Winston Churchill called it an iron curtain descending across Europe. The Cold War was born not from a single battle, but from mistrust, clashing worldviews, and unresolved wartime tensions. The world quickly became divided into two camps: the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. Both sides built nuclear arsenals, formed military alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and fought proxy wars in distant lands. But the lessons of World War II endured. The horrors of genocide, the destruction of cities, and the suffering of civilians shaped international norms and institutions. The Geneva Conventions were revised. The concept of crimes against humanity became enshrined in law. The world promised never again. Education became a tool for peace. Schools taught the causes and consequences of the war. Museums and memorials honored the victims. Survivors of the Holocaust shared their stories. Their testimonies became part of the collective memory of nations. Culturally, the war left deep impressions. Literature, film, art, all grappled with its legacy. From Anne Frank's diary to epic war films, the stories of resistance, survival, and loss continued to shape the imagination. Photographs of concentration camps, bombed-out cities, and wounded soldiers became icons of a shattered century. In science and technology, the war accelerated progress. The development of the atomic bomb had changed the world. Nuclear power would become both an energy source and a global threat. The race for space, the birth of computers, the revolution in medicine, all traced roots to wartime innovation. Socially, the war had changed roles and expectations. Women, who had worked in factories and offices during the war, sought new freedoms and rights. Their contributions could not be ignored. In many countries, the post-war era saw expanded rights for women and minorities. The seeds of civil rights and feminist movements were sown. In the United States, African American soldiers who fought for freedom abroad returned to segregation at home. Their experience and frustration became fuel for change. The contradiction between fighting fascism and enduring racism could not be reconciled. The civil rights struggle gained momentum in the years to come. In the Soviet Union, victory became a source of national pride. The sacrifices made were glorified, the battles mythologized. But repression continued. Stalin's purges and forced labor camps resumed. Eastern Europe remained under tight Soviet control. Dissidents were silenced, uprisings crushed. In Germany, the burden as guilt was heavy. The younger generation asked questions their parents could not answer. How had a civilized nation committed such crimes? How had so many remained silent? Over time, Germany became one of the world's leading advocates for Holocaust remembrance and human rights. In Japan, too, memory was contested. While some accepted responsibility for wartime aggression, Others downplayed or denied atrocities. Tensions with neighboring countries, especially China and Korea, persisted for decades. The scars of World War II shaped the second half of the 20th century. It was a war fought across continents, oceans, and ideologies. It involved the most powerful weapons ever created and the most intimate forms of human cruelty. It united nations in a common cause and tore families apart forever. It taught lessons, some learned, some forgotten. It reminded humanity of its capacity for destruction and for resilience. It showed how quickly order can crumble, how easily hate can spread, and how desperately peace must be defended. The people who lived through it, soldiers, civilians, victims, survivors, carried those memories with them. They rebuilt cities, created new governments, raised children in a different world. They warned that freedom is fragile, that vigilance is necessary, and that history must never be ignored. World War II was not a single event, but a vast, interconnected human experience. It was as much about decisions made in government offices as it was about moments of courage in foxholes, kitchens, and streets. It was about leaders and citizens, hatred and hope, cruelty and compassion. Its end was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of a new era, an era shaped by memory, by fear of repetition, and by the hope that someday war would no longer be necessary to achieve justice or peace. As the war ended, millions of people emerged from the wreckage of a broken world. For survivors of the Holocaust, returning to their homes was often impossible. Their families were gone, their communities destroyed, and in many places, anti-Semitism had not vanished. Many displaced persons, including Jews, lived for years in camps across Europe, waiting for new lives to begin. Some would go to Palestine, others to the United States, Canada, or Australia, building futures from unimaginable pasts. The question of justice loomed large. How to judge crimes that defied law, logic, and conscience? The Allies organized the Nuremberg trials, where leading Nazi officials were charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. For the first time, a court recognized genocide as a distinct crime. The proceedings were detailed, grim, and methodical. Survivors testified. Film footage and documents showed the scope of the Holocaust. The world saw and could no longer deny. Some of the accused were sentenced to death. Others received long prison terms. But many perpetrators at lower levels escaped justice entirely. Even so, Nuremberg established a legal foundation for future international courts and left behind a moral precedent that war and cruelty could not be shielded by official orders or national borders. In the years after the war, the globe was redrawn politically, economically, and ideologically. The United Nations, born in 1945, became the central platform for diplomacy and conflict resolution, although its effectiveness would always depend on the will of powerful nations. The world split into two blocks. The Western democracies, led by the United States, promoted capitalism, free markets, and liberal democracy. The Eastern Bloc, controlled by the Soviet Union, championed communism, central planning, and state authority. Europe became the central front in a new kind of conflict, the Cold War, not fought directly between the superpowers, but through espionage, propaganda, and proxy wars in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Germany, the epicenter of the war, was divided. The western part, under American, British, and French influence, became West Germany, a democratic nation that recovered rapidly under the Marshall Plan. The eastern part became a Soviet satellite, East Germany, where state surveillance, economic controls, and repression defined daily life. Berlin, the former capital of the Reich, was also split in two. In 1961, the Berlin Wall would rise, symbolizing a world divided. Japan, too, underwent transformation. Under American occupation, it adopted a pacifist constitution, renouncing war and rebuilding its economy under democratic governance. Though the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained sources of grief and controversy, post-war Japan would grow into one of the world's leading economies. Its industry surged, its cities were rebuilt, and its society modernized rapidly. Yet war memories endured, particularly in China and Korea, where Japanese atrocities remained vivid and unresolved. The devastation of the war led to dramatic shifts in power and influence. Britain and France, once global empires, began to retreat from their colonies. In India, nationalist movements succeeded. In Africa, independence would come more slowly but steadily. The idea that colonial powers had a moral right to rule others had been shattered by the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom in Europe, while denying it abroad. Across the developing world, new nations emerged, struggling to define themselves amid Cold War pressures and their colonial legacies. The war also accelerated the development of modern technology. Computers, once room-sized calculators designed to break codes, evolved into tools that would revolutionize communication, business, and warfare. Rocket technology, born in German missile programs, became the foundation for the space race. Nuclear power, first unleashed in war, became a civilian energy source. Medical advancements, mass production of antibiotics, surgical techniques, and battlefield medicine saved millions in peacetime. At a personal level, the war had permanently altered how people saw the world. Survivors carried trauma and loss. Soldiers returned changed by what they had witnessed. Women who had filled roles in factories, transport, and even military service did not simply go back to old lives. Many had discovered a sense of purpose and equality that would fuel future rights movements. Societies rebuilt, but the memory of what had happened lived on, in silence, in storytelling, and in the marks left on cities and hearts. In Israel, founded in 1948, many Holocaust survivors found refuge and identity. But the creation of a new state in Palestine also ignited decades of conflict, displacing Arab populations and reshaping Middle Eastern politics. The shadow of war, displacement, and genocide continued to echo in new crises, reminding the world that peace, even when achieved, is never permanent. The war also left behind a new language of ethics and law. Terms like genocide, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing became part of international vocabulary. The idea of human rights gained global traction, not just as an ideal, but as a response to what had been violated on a massive scale. The world's response to future atrocities would never be perfect, but it would never again have the excuse of ignorance. In the decades that followed, every generation would return to the Second World War, in books, films, memorials, and education. For some, it became a source of pride, a just war, fought for freedom, a triumph of good over evil. For others, it was a cautionary tale, a descent into darkness that showed how quickly civilization could crumble. In truth, it was both. World War II was not a single narrative, but 1,000 stories of soldiers who fought, of civilians who suffered, of nations that resisted and others that collaborated, of heroes and victims, of cruelty and courage. It showed humanity at its worst and its best. It reminded us that ideology, when fused with hatred and unchecked power, can lead to catastrophe. That silence and complicity can be as deadly as violence, and that rebuilding is harder than destroying, but more enduring. Today, as generations grow up with no living memory of the war, the responsibility of remembering falls to history. Its lessons are not just about dates and battles, but about vigilance, empathy, and the strength of democratic values. The war ended in 1945, but its echoes remain in the institutions we build, the borders we protect, the freedoms we defend, and the conscience we carry. It was, and still is, the defining conflict of the modern age.